There you go. 4-punch, 5-punch, 6-punch combination. Body shot, bang, 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 bang.
Telling him not to counterpunch.
Boom! Will Rackman get up?
Iron. You're going through all the instructions. This is for the championship of the world. I expect a tough, clean fight. Protect yourself at all times. Any questions from the challenger?
Welcome, fight fans. It is time for the main event of the week. We have episode 41 of the Fight City podcast, and I'm very happy to announce that we are finally back as boxing is starting to make a comeback by virtue of ESPN and Top Rank. Today's episode will cover a quick recap of that action that included Shakur Stevenson and Jesse Magdaleno, and then we will shift gears in the wake of the announcement of one of the biggest heavyweight fights of this era in terms of Tyson Fury versus Anthony Joshua. We will be looking back at two of the biggest heavyweight fights of the past eras, one of which is Jerry Cooney and Larry Holmes. It's just coming off its 38th anniversary. And then we will look at Lewis versus Tyson on its 18th anniversary, two of the most controversial yet most significant heavyweight fights in boxing history.
I expect a tough, clean fight. Protect yourself at all times. Any questions from the challenger?
So mainstream boxing finally returned Tuesday on ESPN. Top Rank featured Shakur Stevenson in a dominant showing against Felix Caraballo, 6-round knockout. Not necessarily the caliber of opposition you'd normally hope a young star like Stevenson would face, but it was still good to quench the thirst nonetheless. I know a lot of boxing fans are kind of parched to see some action regardless of what they see. And you got a taste also of what the new normal might look like in boxing for a little while, with fanless venues, socially distanced commentators and judges, last-minute cancellations, talking about Michaela Meyer had to pull out recently due to a COVID-positive screen. That was very unfortunate. It kind of puts us on edge for the future of boxing, in which you might have even bigger fights that could be canceled all of a sudden by a virus that spreads so easily in this country. So it might take some getting used to. But best case scenario we can hope for is that fighters fight regularly and against other hungry fighters of similar stature. And really that hinges on how well Top Rank and ESPN can cooperate with DAZN and PBC. The degree of collaboration is really going to define what we see in this new normal in the near future. But as I mentioned earlier, we did get some great news this week that a 2-fight deal between Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua in 2021 has been agreed to, and negotiations between Fury and Wilder for a fight at the end of the year are progressing favorably. We'll discuss those later on in the podcast with Elliot McCormick. Personally, I'm a little hesitant about how I feel about a fight between AJ and Fury being signed right before Fury and Wilder have a chance to face off against one another, but I guess crazier things have happened in this sport, and we'll just see how this all materializes, and Tyson Fury really has a chance now to show his greatness, because if he can come out of this, he is one of the modern most accomplished fighters.
I expect a tough, clean fight. Protect yourself at all times. Any questions from the challenger?
And speaking on behalf of thefightcity.com and the rest of the world at large, all of our hearts go out to George Floyd and his loved ones following his tragic death at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer. This event has caused us all to reevaluate race relations and social inequalities in this country, which 38 years ago ignited probably the biggest success in boxing history at the time, Larry Holmes versus Jerry Cooney. Before I go into any further detail on this landmark event, I'd like to turn it over to the Fight City editor-in-chief, Michael Carbert, to discuss his take on one of the most significant events in boxing history.
I expect a tough, clean fight. Protect yourself at all times. Any questions from the challenger?
Thank you, Alden. Great to be with you and to have this chance to reflect on one of the biggest fights of all time. Larry Holmes versus Jerry Cooney, June 1982. And I sometimes get the feeling that boxing fans of today, it's difficult for many of them to appreciate the magnitude of this fight, simply because so much has changed since the early 80s. I think anyone born after, say, roughly 1975, there's some significant things that are really hard to appreciate without taking some time to study the history, to look back. One key thing that's difficult now to really understand and appreciate is how big Muhammad Ali was. I mean, very few public figures today can be as huge as he was, because the culture was different, technology was different, the focus was sharper. There weren't as many opportunities for people to escape mass media and be absorbed in their own individual niches, so to speak. Now, if your enthusiasm is Japanese animation, you can just immerse yourself in that and ignore the larger culture to a certain degree. Back in the 1970s, 1980s, you couldn't do that. The internet didn't exist. There were only, for most people, there were only, I think, about a dozen channels on the television. And Muhammad Ali was a huge world figure, the dominant figure in boxing, the dominant figure in sports. And the problem, of course, was that, or at least for many, the problem was that he was black. And unashamedly black, proudly black. It's difficult for some to look back and fully appreciate how white American culture was in the 1980s, in the 1970s and 80s. The culture was changing, but it was still a dominantly white culture. There's a reason why the Rocky movies were about a white fighter. And those Rocky movies were huge in the late 70s, early 80s. So in order to appreciate the impact of Larry Holmes versus Jerry Cooney, you have to have some understanding of the context, the cultural context. Boxing was, at that time, still part of the mainstream culture in the way that it isn't today, for the most part. The super fights of the 1970s and 80s, and that's what people called them back then, super fights. Ali versus Frazier, Sugar Ray Leonard versus Roberto Duran. These fights were huge. They were as big as the Super Bowl, if not bigger, in terms of cultural interest and impact. So for a white heavyweight to come along in the 1980s, the early 80s, just when Muhammad Ali it was clear by this time, he was gone, he was finished. Larry Holmes, in a fight that should never have happened, in 1980, had defeated Ali, and it was obvious that Ali was done. And almost as if on cue, along comes Jerry Cooney, a big, powerful, white heavyweight. And so, when we talk about Larry Holmes versus Jerry Cooney in 1982, we're talking about a different time. We're talking about when America was still, for lack of a better term, a white country. We're talking about a time when very few people anyway, were familiar with the term multiculturalism, when the term politically correct Didn't exist yet. And so the prospect of a white, undefeated heavyweight champion of the world, this was something the whole country could, give or take, the whole country could really get behind. Millions of people were tired of Muhammad Ali. They were tired of a brash, boastful black man who was a constant reminder of the racism of American culture. People didn't want to have to reflect on that, think about that. They could, and they would be able to forget about it, at least for a while, if they had, for the first time since Rocky Marciano in the 1950s, a white heavyweight champion of the world. The whole country was excited about this prospect. You can't, the bottom line here is you can't talk about Holmes versus Cooney without talking about race. Race is the reason why Jerry Cooney, in the lead up to the fight, it was Jerry Cooney on the cover of Sports Illustrated and Time magazine, not the heavyweight champion of the world, Larry Holmes. Holmes was the champion. Holmes had defeated Ali. Holmes had a string of successful title defenses, but he lacked mass appeal. He didn't excite the public. And people were used to having a heavyweight champion who was exciting. I mean, Ali, whether you loved him or hated him, you couldn't deny he knew how to get the television cameras and the media all pointing at him. He knew how to make things exciting. Holmes just didn't have the same kind of charisma. And when Cooney came along, it wasn't that Cooney was particularly charismatic either, but he was something new and different. A big white fighter who could really, his talent was undeniable. He had a terrific punching power, and he won a string of dramatic knockouts. He had a string of dramatic knockouts leading up to the fight, most notably a 54-second knockout of Ken Norton, the same Ken Norton who had given Holmes one of the toughest fights, the toughest fight of his career, and one of the best heavyweight fights of recent memory, a 15-round war. The same Ken Norton, less than 2 years removed from that fight, Cooney demolished him. And so there was no question that Jerry Cooney was the fighter that everybody wanted to see take on Holmes, and the American culture would have welcomed a Jerry Cooney, a white heavyweight champion, with open arms. Cooney was poised to become the biggest, not just the biggest star of boxing since Muhammad Ali, but arguably the biggest star in sports since Babe Ruth, maybe. That's how big Jerry Cooney might have been. And that's why the people behind him wouldn't let him fight. There's a long period of inactivity between that 54-second demolition of Ken Norton and then the fight with Larry Holmes. Because the people who handled Jerry Cooney's career, they knew they had the jackpot, they had the mother lode, and they didn't want to do anything to jeopardize it. Race was the reason for all this. Race was the reason that Jerry Cooney was worth so much money and why the fight was so big. It should be remembered that Jerry Cooney was the challenger, and yet, as I mentioned, he was the one on the cover of Time magazine, and he was the one who got the most money. On paper, Larry Holmes and Jerry Cooney were getting equal purses, $10 million each. In fact, what we now know, according to Larry Holmes, is that he only saw maybe 3 or 4 million of that 10 million. Whereas Cooney got the big jackpot, one fight, he was set for life. He's never had to worry about money ever since. However, the only problem, and as most close observers of boxing knew or should have known, Larry Holmes was clearly the better fighter. He had more experience. He was more skilled. Cooney, though, had the power, and that was the drama of the fight itself. Would Cooney be able to land the big shots that he had landed on Jimmy Young and Ron Lyle and Ken Norton and decide the match fairly quickly and dramatically? Or would Holmes have the requisite skill, defensive skill, to neutralize Cooney's power, take the younger, less experienced man into deep water, and eventually triumph? As a result, the fight itself, looked at from a certain perspective, is not particularly dramatic. Holmes was always ahead. Holmes was always in control. He scored a knockdown in the second round to show that he had the power to hurt Cooney. He hurt Cooney again badly in round 6. But interestingly, no one could know it at the time, but Jerry Cooney gave the most courageous performance of his career that night. There's no question he was suffering from ring rust. There was the pressure on him going into that fight was immense. And yet he managed to give a boxer of greater skill and experience a pretty tough fight. Holmes later acknowledged it was one of his tougher fights, and that some of the shots that Cooney landed on him, they were definitely hurtful. But in the end, it was experience that told the story of that fight, and Holmes eventually forced a stoppage in round 13 when he had Cooney virtually helpless and out on his feet. But again, the significance of the fight is not so much what happened in the ring, but more the fact that this is one of the biggest fights of all time. At the time, in 1982, the fight set records. It was the biggest fight in history. Many people don't know that now because people don't like to dwell on this fight. A few years back, 5 or 6 years ago, I think, ESPN did a list of the biggest, most exciting super fights of all time. On the list was, of course, Hagler versus Hearns, Leonard versus Hearns. They even put Riddick Bowe versus Evander Holyfield, which, yeah, it was a big fight, but it wasn't exactly a huge crossover mainstream attraction. Conspicuous by its absence was Holmes versus Cooney. It didn't make the list. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out why. People don't like to dwell on this fight because the fight was, like it or not, about race. That's why Cooney was on the cover of Time magazine, as I mentioned. That's why the fight was so huge, because America would have been so thrilled to have a white heavyweight champion of the world. And it's poignant, especially now, to reflect on how America has changed since. George Floyd was murdered by the police in front of our eyes, his murder captured by a cell phone camera. And we are seeing now how America has changed, how America as a country is, we hope, finally saying clearly, loudly, enough is enough. Because it is past time. It is past time that black people, all people of color, are treated just the same as anyone else in America. And this is what Muhammad Ali was saying way back in the 1960s when he beat Sonny Liston and then announced that he was a member of the Black Muslims, that he was changing his name to Muhammad Ali, and that he was not going to be drafted into the army and support the war in Vietnam. He made it very clear. Black people should have the same rights as white people. We're not going to be pushed around anymore. And unfortunately, that message hasn't gotten through as much as it should, even though America has had a black president since then, even though so much has changed, including the fact that if Jerry Cooney versus Larry Holmes, if that fight were to take place today, yeah, it would maybe be a pretty big fight, but it would not have nearly the same kind of impact as it did back in 1982. Holmes versus Cooney in 1982 is a unique cultural moment, not just in terms of boxing or in terms of sport, but in terms of the larger culture. A fascinating event. And these are the things I think of when I look back on a fight that I think deserves even more attention, scrutiny, reflection than it usually receives, especially given the cultural moment that we're going through now.
I expect a tough, clean fight. Protect yourself at all times. Any questions from the challenger?
And that was Michael Carver talking about his takeaways of one of the biggest events in boxing history, Holmes versus Cooney. And you know, one angle of this event that I feel like many people overlook because of the amount of money he made from it was that Jerry Cooney was really every bit as much a victim of the racial hype as Holmes and many fellow African Americans were, in the sense that, you know, Cooney was open from the onset of the promotion that he never wanted to be known as the Great White Hope, and that he never viewed it as a black-white fight. You know, the kind of angle that Don King and Cooney's promoter Dennis Rappaport exploited for monetary gain. It never really appealed to him personally. And while he made a record purse for his loss, the effect on Cooney psychologically can't be quantified. And Cooney felt, because of all the pressure put on him, that he let down so many of his fans for a cause that he never really supported. And, you know, it took Cooney a long time to get where he was today, you know, kind of a happy, free-spirited supporter of the sport, because after his career spiraled following the loss to Holmes, I mean, he suffered from substance abuse, depression, inactivity. It's just one of the angles that's often overlooked because, I mean, Jerry Cooney was, quote unquote, the Great White Hope, but never signed up for that at all. So joining me is Elliot McCormick, fellow writer for thefightcity.com. What are your takeaways from this landmark event?
Well, Alden, I think that Michael and you have summed it up really nicely, and your point is apt about Jerry Cooney, who seems to be a very unassuming guy, getting caught up in this, I guess, maelstrom of you know, racial discourse. He seems like a very unassuming guy, and it's unfortunate that so much pressure was put on him, pressure that I don't think he was able to deal with. But it sort of speaks to how people's careers are often determined by forces much bigger than them. So in this case, I guess social forces, the whims of the promoters involved in the fight, choosing to go in a particular direction. And it kind of brings up a great hypothetical that I wanted to get your take on. And that is, if on the one hand, Cooney's promoters maneuvered him into an incredibly financially advantageous position, so he made a lot of money, but by doing so, did they ruin him over the long term by not, I guess, allowing him to mature better to where he would have been more mentally and physically able to meet Holmes on a more level playing surface had he had more time to develop as a fighter?
Yeah, I mean, I think Michael, as well as yourself, hit it on the nose in the sense that Cooney was very inactive before he fought Holmes. They were marketing him very carefully as a commodity, not really as a budding star that they Guys like Rappaport just wanted to cash out. I think guys like Barry Tompkins on HBO's Legendary Nights kind of hit it on the nose as well when he said that he thought of Cooney as really much of a product as anything. A guy that has real talent, but wasn't used with his best intentions in mind. I mean, Cooney was a terrific body puncher, ranked as, I think, the 53rd greatest puncher in boxing history, if you can believe that, by Ring Magazine,
Right.
back in the early 21st century. But yeah, his career really didn't pan out the way I think it could have. I mean, he was very inactive following the Holmes fight. He was kind of thrown in there by Butch Lewis as the optimal opponent for Michael Spinks. That didn't go so well. We know what happened with George Foreman. I'm just surprised, and I'm happy for him that he's able to find solace in the sport now with what he's done for retired fighters, helping them find what they need in terms of financial support and emotional support. Working with Larry Holmes to do that with their organization and training some young fighters because let's be honest, I don't think the sport, besides the money he made, really did him any favors. Talking about Jerry Cooney.
Yeah, no, you make a good point. So it definitely seems as if he's kind of come full circle with his career, that he can look back on it, you would hope, with some fond memories. And after Holmes didn't fight for a couple of years, and then, as you said, the last, after Philip Brown, he fought 4 more times, losing twice to Spinks and then Foreman. Foreman said, I think later, that Jerry Cooney was the hardest, or one of the hardest punchers he ever faced. Yeah. So, I mean, that I guess is something that you can hang your hat on when your career is over. But it's funny too, because George Foreman was a guy who also, I mean, the circumstances were much different going into his fight with Muhammad Ali, but after that sort of crushing loss, Foreman also entered into a time of profound depression, and I suppose had to find himself again. So it's difficult to imagine the mental damage that a loss of that magnitude inflicts on a fighter. But it seems as if in both cases, and while they were coming from different areas or different places in the sport, both Foreman and Jerry Cooney experienced that.
Yeah. Jerry Cooney, you could hear him on his podcast. He's a host to one of the podcasts on one of the radio shows. Very good stuff. He's a very happy-go-lucky fighter. You see him at all the fights in New York. A really great guy to meet if you ever come across him. He's definitely not as intimidating as he looks, despite his stature.
Right.
He's always smiling. He's just great to talk to.
Yeah, he seems like a gentleman for sure, and someone that you certainly think would not have been comfortable with how racialized that whole promotion became.
Yeah, that was it was the perfect storm. It's very unfortunate that had to happen. Just because the fight in and of itself was a great fight. It was a great matchup. It didn't really need to, for a boxing purist, take on that other level, that social overlap that was spoken about, that made the event what it was, because in and of itself, it was a terrific fight. And hopefully when people think of Holmes Cooney, they think of the fight itself, at least to some decent extent, to how they think of the event and the significance it had in history, and not just boxing history. Because it really was one of those fights, as mentioned earlier, that really kind of it was a landmark in boxing's racial history. Because, I mean, we go back and we think of the color line that was first defined by John L. Sullivan and not wanting to give guys like Peter Jackson a fight. And we think of the same excuse used by Gene Tunney and Jack Dempsey, talking about Harry Wills. And now we look at boxing, and it's one of the most globalized sports in the world. But, 38 years ago, we had a fight that was built on racial divide. So it's a very huge milestone in the sport's history. Very fascinating one.
Yeah, I agree. But I also think that in the intervening years, like from that fight in 1982 until now, like there still is like a tremendous amount of racial bias in boxing in all sports, to my view. So whether it's explicit, as it was in that case, or implicit, as it often is now, I think it still exists to a degree. And we are, of course, talking about this in the wake of what happened in the U.S. With the killing of George Floyd, and and how that event has kind of put these issues, in the forefront of public consciousness, and for good measure. So it's interesting to look back on Holmes Cooney now in light of what's happened recently.
Definitely. Well, last week was a very historic week for heavyweight boxing. Interestingly enough, one of the biggest heavyweight fights of this era was announced, at least on a preliminary basis, or a tentative basis, I should say, with Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury. Two fights were announced for 2021. I'm not sure if that would play out smoothly if Tyson Fury were to struggle to get past Deontay Wilder later this year. But we have a lot of great heavyweight fights on the horizon going forward. But 18 years ago, 20 years after Holmes Cooney, we had another massive heavyweight fight, Lewis Tyson, producing a similar level of hype. A fight that culminated one of the most tumultuous eras in heavyweight history, the 90s, and maybe the late 80s if you include Tyson in his prime. On a technical level, you couldn't pick a worse time for this fight to take place. Tyson is nearly 36, hasn't faced a top heavyweight in years. Nevertheless, still the biggest name in the sport. And Lennox, who dominated the division as long as Tyson was on his downward spiral, he was 2 fights away from his stunning KO defeat to Hasim Rahman, which made the fight even more interesting and made even some experts doubt whether or not this could be the perfect storm for Tyson to make history again and regain the heavyweight title after all these years. But, boy, were they wrong, right?
They were. They certainly were wrong, and people were underestimating Lennox Lewis. But I remember this vividly with when I first started watching boxing and reading about boxing. That's when Tyson had first came out of jail. So he was obviously the most prominent member in the sport when it was a sport that I was becoming acquainted with for the first time. So I'd always followed his career very closely. But by the time that he got to Lennox Lewis, who's clearly a shell of the ferocious fighter he had been in the 1980s. And when you look at his body, when he steps in the ring against Lewis, like he looks kind of paunchy, he's slow, he's lead-footed, and he just looks like a shell of his former self. So I think that prior to that fight, he was a 2-1 underdog in Vegas, but I don't know how many really savvy boxing people thought that Tyson had a shot.
Yeah, it seemed like the people that did were just so psyched out by the event that they lost touch with their more intellectual prowess on how the fight was going to go down.
Right.
What really struck me when I was watching the fight again the other day was that it was very quick for Tyson to look like he was ready to quit. After 1-2 rounds, you can just see it was very clear that Tyson just didn't look like he was in it anymore mentally. And there's even more fascinating than Ronnie Shields freaking out later in the fight was that he was almost exclusively focused on keeping Tyson confident enough in the corner to keep going out. That's what it looked like. He was just kind of his cheerleader. He almost looked like he knew Tyson going in didn't really want to be in there and was just kind of trying to keep him confident enough to keep going out. It was stunning. It looked like Tyson, gave all that he could in the pre-fight, couldn't really get a reaction out of Lewis, just humiliated himself again, and really when he got in the ring, he had nothing.
Yeah, I agree.
Spurts.
Yeah, 100%. And I think like one of the signature moments of that fight is the press conference they had. I think it was in January of that year where Tyson rushed Lennox Lewis and they're doing that stare down, and then a brawl ensued. And then Lewis said afterwards that Tyson bit his ankle, for which Mike had to eventually pay him $335,000 or something like that. And then afterwards, Tyson gets into that exchange with the reporter in the crowd, and the reporter says, get him a straitjacket. And then Mike just goes off and he starts yelling all sorts of obscenities at the guy, to the point where he works himself into such a frenzy. It looks like he's crying, and I think he is. And like, over the years, Tyson's behavior and his public commentary has been so inconsistent that it's very difficult to get a clear sense of who that guy is. But I think at that moment, you have the truest sense of how he is at that moment. And that's just a person who's completely fed up and frustrated with himself, because I think he knows he's become a fraud. Like, why else would he have to intimidate Lewis to that degree, unless he was trying to, I suppose, prove to himself that he still had what it took to win. Like it's kind of funny when you think about Tyson and Customato and all of the mythology of their relationship at Catskills, because so much of it was built on, or I guess so much of it remains the sort of like mental mastery that D'Amato impressed on Tyson, and Tyson being a pretty contemplative, philosophical guy, likes to talk about the mindset required to be a champion boxer. And I think at his best, like, he was always so intimidating and menacing, but he had a kind of a quiet confidence to him as a young guy back in the late 80s, and that had completely left him by that point. And it seems as if he was trying to convince himself that he still had a shot.
It's kind of sad when you look back at it, because Tyson in the 80s, he loved the sport of boxing. He was a boxing historian. He absolutely, he was in the age before YouTube. He was talking about Tom Sharkey footage against Jim Jeffries. So I mean, it's, you almost put yourself in his shoes and think of a guy that had so much love for the sport of boxing. It brought him off the streets. It really developed him into a young man with Customato. And then he just, by 97, with the Holyfield ear bite and antics after that, he just completely made a mockery of that sport and continued to do so. And, his farewell after the McBride fight, I remember, the middle fingers to the fans, the hell with fighting. It's kind of strange when you think how he got to that area. And really, I think it comes down to a few bad actors in boxing. But for a long time, he really just hated the sport, and it had to be conflicting him internally because, as you mentioned, there's a lot of inconsistencies in his dialogue going on there.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, he was also talking, I think, at his training camp in Hawaii about wanting to stomp the testicles of the reporters' children, so they could feel his pain, and then you contrast that with the pretty dignified way he handled the loss when he kind of softly wiped the blood from Lennox Lewis's face afterwards. And you look at Tyson in that moment, you think, well, okay, has he kind of learned his lesson? Is this the new Mike? But then, of course, as you said, after the McBride fight and in other incidents since then, or I guess between then, because he's, subsequently become, a positive person, but that kind of behavior just persisted throughout the years. And I don't know. Why is that? I don't know. I think it would probably be grandiose to play armchair psychologist to try to figure out the way his mind is working at that time. But he just seemed like a guy who just wasn't content with what he'd become. As you mentioned, he used to love boxing. It was once a source of pride. And I think it stopped being that for a long time. Yeah.
I don't know what Lennox was thinking when he gave Mike his baby in the dressing room after the fight.
That's a trusting man.
I mean, I don't care how forgiving Tyson was in the post-fight press conference, acting so nice and wiping the blood or the sweat away from his face. I mean, that's a boundary I don't think he'd ever cross after some of the remarks Tyson made in the pre-fight.
Okay, so I thought Tyson was holding his own baby in the dressing room afterwards. That was Lennox Lewis's baby?
I thought it was. I think that's how they that's how I heard it in the Legendary Nights documentary.
Okay.
But yeah, that was quite an oddity. And Tyson is he's very difficult to read. And that was a fight that definitely could have happened 10 years before, which brings me to my next question is, let's take Tyson Lewis over several different 90s eras, because as I mentioned, the 90s was one of the most tumultuous eras in fighting, and Lennox Lewis went through multiple different transformations in that year, starting from the power punching destroyer that he was against Razor Ruddock, and then the vulnerability that he showed against McCall and Mercer, and then the complete package that he became by the end of the 90s. Do you think there was a Lennox Lewis that Mike Tyson could have beaten if they fought either early, mid, or late 90s?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I was thinking about that yesterday. So as I was rewatching the fight, but I think if Mike had met him at in his prime when he was younger, he would have certainly stood a much better chance of winning. Like the guy that fought Lewis in Memphis was just so slow and lead-footed and ponderous, and he had no head movement. He was just looking to throw one punch. He wasn't putting together combinations. Like he was nothing like what he had been. So I mean, it's difficult to ever predict with certainty, of course, what would have happened. But I would have liked Mike's chances earlier in his career, but certainly as things went on, and then Lewis blossomed into this total package, as you said, that beating him for Tyson, I think, became just an unrealistic proposition. What do you think? I mean, if had they met in 1990, pre-Buster Douglas, what would have happened?
I think I was watching the Razor Ruddock fight, and before that, no one did that to Razor Ruddock before. When Lewis hit him in '92, and just took him out in 2 rounds, Tyson knocked Ruddock down a few times, but Ruddock was right back in his face, giving him all he could handle, especially the second fight. Tyson took some huge shots, and he was hurt by Ruddock, and Lewis just kind of blew him away. So I almost think Lewis is the bigger puncher. He's a stronger man than Tyson, might be the more explosive puncher. Tyson obviously is a lot more agile, a lot quicker, takes punches better than Lennox Lewis, but I'm not sure. I think probably the pre-Emmanuel Stewart Lennox Lewis probably would have lost 6 out of 10 times to Mike Tyson, probably by a knockout.
Yeah.
But he definitely could have hurt Mike Tyson. I think I think it would have been a very interesting fight.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. And Lewis never earned the respect his power deserved because he was a legitimately hard puncher. And when I referenced what would have happened if they fought in 1990, had not even really been a fair comparison because that would have been so early in
he pre-prime Lewis.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, one thing as well is that Lewis is just such huge physical advantages over Tyson. So he came into the ring, in shape at 250 pounds. Tyson came in, to my eyes anyway, relatively out of shape. That wasn't an ideal, body type for him, and he was still 20 pounds less than a guy who was bigger, stronger, using his size to lean on him, owning him in the clinches. So it was just he was just a very difficult guy to fight against. And I mean, when you see what happened to heavyweight boxing after Lennox Lewis retired, you kind of you certainly appreciate his talent and how comprehensive his skills were in retrospect, because I don't think there's been anyone close to him since. And I'm happy that we're now seeing some good action by the heavyweights of this era. But to my view, and I'd like to hear your opinion, like none of them are even nearly as complete as Lennox Lewis was at his best.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think Lennox was much more athletic than Anthony Joshua. I mean, maybe in terms of their punching, the way that how schooled Anthony Joshua is and his punching arsenal, there's some similarities to Lennox Lewis, but Lewis was also very agile, and he also threw very unorthodox punches, and he was a master boxer. I mean, what he did to David Tua was a masterpiece, I thought. I mean, if you had a height disadvantage against Lewis, by the time he was in 1999, 2000 version, you were pretty much toast. I mean, he just mastered the art of being the taller fighter, which is somewhere that Anthony Joshua has fallen short of. I mean, Vladimir Klitschko did it very well as well, but Lennox Lewis, he made the style of being the bigger, taller man a style in and of itself better than a lot of people have done in the past. And Vladimir Klitschko carried the division for a decade with that same exact approach, perfected by Emmanuel Stewart.
Right.
Right now, at least when it comes to Anthony Joshua, it's kind of disappointing that guys get inside of him so easily. Guys like Povetkin and Andy Ruiz, Tyson Fury offers a little more flexibility, but I mean, then again, Lennox Lewis is a lot better schooled than Tyson Fury, in my opinion. Even if he might not be as athletic. So, from a purist like myself, I prefer watching Lennox Lewis fight over Tyson Fury. Ever since Lennox Lewis retired, it's kind of like the bar for acceptable heavyweight talent's been lowered. First it was Vitaly Klitschko, and it was watching him. Okay, he has that European style, but he wins fights, so it's okay if everything he does is unconventional. And then Vladimir Klitschko, the jab and grab, but okay, he's winning all his fights, and right now it's kind of a resurgence of guys that are actually able and talented in the heavyweight division, but it's still a far cry from the era of Lennox Lewis and Evander Holyfield, in my opinion. The bar is a lot lower now.
That's it is, unfortunately, and Lewis was just such like a total professional. Like, he was smart, he was big, he was strong, he was precise. He could take you out. He could think his way around the ring. He could really do it all. So it's kind of funny because back in the day, in the 1990s, Tyson was kind of the rage for so long, and the myth of kind of Tyson's invincibility persisted. But all the while, Lennox Lewis, in a rather understated way, was fashioning this fantastic career for himself. And by the time they met, one guy had just clearly surpassed the other, and there would be no looking back.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of threw him under the bus for his performance against Mercer, and I shouldn't, because I thought both men were terrific in that fight. That's an unbelievable fight. If any of you listeners haven't seen it yet, Lennox Lewis versus Ray Mercer. I mean, can you think of another heavyweight that goes to the body in combinations like Lennox does, and mixes in the uppercut? I mean, the uppercut was a thing of beauty with Lennox Lewis. But I'm definitely going off my rocker with my admiration for Lewis.
No, he was a great fighter, but I kind of want to get your opinion on this. And I was just watching the fight yesterday. Lewis had such kind of relaxed style. It almost looked like he was taking it easy sometimes, but I think that was just the way that he felt comfortable fighting in. Whereas Tyson would sort of rush forward with you, this kind of compact, muscular guy. Lewis was taller, rangier, a little lankier, and he always seemed to be very relaxed in the ring, to his great credit. He said that's a great way to fight, just be relaxed and loose. But I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong or just not seeing this the right way, but it may have looked on the surface as if he was never fighting as hard as he could have been, or trying as hard as he could have been. And I'm not just suggesting that was the case, but he just made it look so easy or casual, I suppose. That might be.
He was definitely fighting within himself. I mean, a lot of guys, it took a certain level of fighter to bring out that kind of intensity in Lennox Lewis. Yeah. Especially guys that are shorter than him. When Lennox Lewis is fighting a taller fighter, you kind of see a different version of Lewis, a very kind of a sloppy, aggressive version of Lewis that you saw against Michael Grant and Vitaly Klitschko. But definitely when he had a height advantage, he was just able to control fighters with his size. I mean, that was part of the Lennox Lewis package that Emmanuel Stewart perfected. I think probably his second fight against Evander Holyfield was one of his tougher fights technically, because despite his size advantage, he was always on his toes, and he fought a very, very good version of Holyfield, probably the best version of Holyfield since the Tyson fights, in my opinion. But yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with you that he was definitely untested by very top-notch opposition, guys that should have given him more of a scare, but he was able to completely shut down and neutralize. And I think it kind of hurt him in his fight against Hasim Rahman, because Rahman almost lulled him to sleep and put him to sleep just about that right hand.
Right. And I think that loss clearly gave the media a lot of fodder to hype up his match with Tyson, because if you get knocked out by a relative unknown like Rahman, then what is Iron Mike going to do to him?
Well, first of all, I don't understand why Mike Tyson was ranked so high in the Ring Magazine heavyweight rankings for as long as he was. I mean, why is Mike Tyson ranked number 2 for 2 years in a row, 2000 and 2001, above Evander Holyfield or Kirk Johnson or Vladimir Klitschko for the year 2000? I mean, that just didn't exactly jibe with me. Why he was getting so much credit for, first of all, not fighting often, second of all, fighting pretty terrible quality of opposition around that time.
Right, fighting what, like 19 rounds in 5 years prior to meeting Lewis. But I mean, Tyson is a guy who, as a fighter, was just always given the benefit of the doubt because he had been the ultimate cash cow for so long. And I think people were just so desperate for him to return to prominence and be a viable entity in boxing again that they would, I guess, rank him highly or provide any sort of excuse to kind of keep that, cash train going. But eventually, he had to come to an end.
Yeah. Lennox Lewis certainly put him to an end in Memphis, Tennessee on June 8th with that right hand in the 8th round. Certainly one of the most interesting fights. Highly recommend all of our listeners, if they haven't seen it before, watch the legendary night on Mike Tyson versus Lennox Lewis, as well as Holmes Cooney. Definitely gets you some perspective on the heavyweight division when it was as prominent as it will ever be. Of course, we're seeing something of a renaissance now with Tyson Fury attempting to unify the division, with Anthony Joshua coming up in his third fight against Deontay Wilder. But it's a very exciting time for boxing, heavyweight boxing, as long as we, get through these very volatile COVID times and this new normal that we're experiencing. And I hope that you're enjoying what is left of boxing right now, Elliot. I know it takes some getting used to, but I'm sure you were as thrilled as I was to see boxing back on TV this week.
Yeah, definitely happy it's come back, and I look forward to watching more fights in the upcoming months, especially as we head toward the end of the year when sports have hopefully returned to normal and we get to see the big matches that we've been waiting for. So I guess that would be Fury Wilder, and then if we're talking about his trajectory on his way to Anthony Joshua, potentially Fury Dillian White, and then if all goes to plan, he will eventually meet with AJ. Do you think that is a viable roadmap for Tyson Fury?
I've been saying this for a long time about AJ and Wilder, but I think that it still speaks volumes when it comes to Fury as well, is that these aren't invincible heavyweights. No heavyweights are invincible. I mean, these guys are big enough that they could remove each other from consciousness with one punch. We know that. But I mean, AJ and Wilder, back when they were on a collision course to face each other, before Fury was even active after the Klitschko fight, I wanted these guys to fight as soon as possible because I knew, looking at them, that they were vulnerable to get beaten. AJ, terrific fighter at the time, still is. He had plenty of technical flaws before we even saw the chin that was exposed against Andy Ruiz, and Wilder, of course, he's a technical disaster waiting to get exploited. As a matter of fact, that happened before they were able to fight each other. And now I'm hearing about Fury versus Wilder. Of course, they have a rematch clause, but AJ versus Kubrat Pulev and whoever else, and if Fury ends up fighting Dillian White. I think these fights tend to pan out into bigger events when they are on a collision course directly with each other and not sidetracked by other able heavyweights like Pulev and Dillian White. I think these are tumultuous times indeed that, these guys could easily be sidetracked. I mean, hell, even Tyson Fury against who was the Swede that he fought? I'm actually forgetting his name.
Wallin?
Speaks volumes. Yeah, Otto Wallin. He was almost derailed by a cut. I mean, that can happen, in addition to some of the adversity that he faced there. Of course, Wilder, with his punching power, could knock Fury out with one punch. It's very conceivable. He almost did it in their first fight. I wouldn't wait. Even if it means that they can't unify all four, even if one of these sanctioning bodies is going to strip them, I think that's immaterial when you're talking about a fight of the magnitude of Joshua versus Fury. I mean, this is probably would go down as the biggest fight in British boxing history, and I don't say that lightly. So make it happen as soon as possible. I mean, if I were Fury, I would pay Wilder off if Wilder were to accept any sum. I'll take that fight later. I'll settle a score with you later. I want to, make the biggest fight that I will ever be able to make against Anthony Joshua, coming off a win against Andy Ruiz. How much more victories against top-notch opposition do we have to bite our fingernails as Joshua goes through? I mean, there's not a given that he beats Kubrat Pulev, who's a big puncher in his own right.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like I would love for Fury to bypass the third Wilder fight. As a fan, I have no reason to see that. He authoritatively beat him down in February, and of course, the possibility always exists that Wilder could land his Sunday punch and put Fury to sleep. But to me, the possibility of that is pretty unrealistic. Like Fury is such a savvy fighter that I don't know if he would put himself in harm's way in like a third match with Deontay Wilder. So I mean, do what you have to do. If you have to pay him off to leapfrog him and perhaps leapfrog Dillian White and get to AJ, I think that's the route to take. The logistics of that obviously are way more complicated than we're kind of making it out to be right now. But the ideal trajectory in my eyes would be to go right to that fight. And I say that not taking into account all of the business variables that have to be considered. So wishful thinking on my part for sure. As for Pulev, I mean, I think that AJ would probably walk through him. Maybe I'm underestimating Pulev. I don't really know, but like that to me seems the fight least fraught with danger when you're talking about Fury going up against Wilder and then going up against Dillian White.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Dillian White, I mean, with all due respect to White and his ability, I think he would just be outsized and overmatched technically by Tyson Fury. So, I would, don't get me wrong, I would have my money on both Fury and AJ to prevail in their preliminary fights before fighting each other. But, I mean, it's just, the risk of a heavyweight disaster, and we've seen many in history, just derailing a mega fight. We've already missed out on one mega fight with Wilder versus Joshua. I wouldn't want to miss out on this one, particularly if I was a British boxing fan. And, talk about social distancing. Yeah, I can't think of an easier venue than the Wembley Arena, Wembley Stadium, to have a nice distance crowd, still packing 40, 50,000 seats perhaps.
Yeah, if it even happens there, like I was reading about Eddie Hearn talking about how there's more money elsewhere. They could go to Saudi Arabia. They could go somewhere else. That's him, I guess, probably trying to drive more money to the fight. But to me, it would be a huge shame if it was held anywhere but United Kingdom. If there are two British fighters, that's the most rabid fan base right now. Like
at least one of the fights.
Right. You have to give the people, some meat to chew on, especially because the fans are so responsible for helping to kind of, I don't know if you could really say revive that scene, but just really take it to a new level to where right now it's probably the best domestic scene in the world and has been for some time.
Yeah. I think it's the fight they deserve. I mean, these are two of their prodigal sons, in essence.
Yeah. So looking ahead to that fight, if and when they do get in the ring together, assuming, the preliminary problems don't happen, what do you think happens? Who do you like? Do you like Fury or do you like AJ?
I like Fury. I think he's just the more fluid fighter, the more able fighter. He's shown the ability to adapt, change up his style. AJ surprised me a little bit in the second fight with Ruiz by his ability to be a little more loose in there and rely on his size and footwork in ways that he hadn't done in the first fight with Ruiz. A little more fluid, but he was still fighting kind of a non-factor in Andy Ruiz in the second fight. I'm not sure how much he really showed by just staying outside a plodding tub of goo.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Andy Ruiz, who I enjoyed his first victory. I enjoyed the interview tour he did afterwards. He seemed like a cool guy, but he did embarrass himself in that second fight, coming in so grossly overweight, putting in such a terrible effort. And kudos to Joshua for winning, but to me, it's still not a very impressive effort. You have a guy in there who looks like Superman, and I know that muscles are not everything or really anything in boxing, but to me, Joshua is still kind of a fragile heavyweight. Like he clearly has no faith in his jaw. He didn't want to engage at all, and I agree that Fury has to be the favorite if and when they do meet up. And I wonder, not necessarily whether Fury will outpoint him, because I think he could probably do that. I won't say easily, but I think he could do that.
Yeah, I mean, he's got the 3-inch height advantage, and
right, without a stretch of the imagination. But to me, it's more, will he knock him out? And that to me would be the big question going into a fight with AJ.
Well, and if he came in the way he came in against Deontay Wilder with a more aggressive posture. If he comes straight ahead, then he allows AJ to get off a lot easier without AJ having to come at him and pursue him, which would, in some sense, you'd think, give AJ a better opportunity to score with some of his hard punches, but I'm not sure. I think Tyson Fury, I would favor him in the fight. Of course, I hope it's competitive enough that they can all get their money's worth on the second fight, which seems to have been agreed to
right
ahead of time.
And hopefully other things like preliminary fights that don't necessarily have to happen don't derail the super fight from taking place.
Yeah, I mean, injuries aside, a loss would be obviously detrimental to the promotion. People have got around it before. Eric Morales getting beat by Zaire Rahim, I'm thinking of, and fights of that nature. They were still able to go forward with the main promotion, but
right.
I think these guys, they can't really find a better time to fight each other than right now. And I wish them the most straightforward, streamlined path to getting that done. But I think, I wouldn't be surprised if we have some unfortunate surprises in there, and they might have to reconsider the promotion that they've seemed to agree to already.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. You never know with boxing. It's a snake pit where things often go wrong. So, looking into the future is probably a fool's errand, or having too much faith in the future, I suppose, would be a bit of a fool's errand.
Yeah, particularly with heavyweight boxing.
Yeah.
But anyways, thanks for being on, Elliot. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Alden.
Yeah, absolutely. And that wraps it up for episode 41 of the Fight City podcast. Look forward to hearing from you guys in the future.
I expect a tough, clean fight. Protect yourself at all times. Any questions from the challenger?